finally, a fourth reality in God's dealings with Israel, there of the potential of judgment. And this was a very sobering matter. He mentions it in verse 6 and verse 11 and 17 following. Maybe just time to read verses 17 to the end of the chapter, because our founding fathers were well aware of that as additionally. Otherwise, you may say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand have made me this wealth. But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who is giving you power to make wealth, that He may confirm His covenant, which He swore to your fathers, as it is this day. And it shall come about, if you ever forget the Lord your God, and go after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you today, that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so you shall perish, because you would not listen to the voice of the Lord your God. The potential for judgment. That was that fourth reality. Now, the Declaration of Independence. And this is fun. You don't have a copy of it before you, I don't imagine, but you can get a copy, and you really should, and go back and find the passages for yourself. And I think you'll find it a very fruitful study. It won't take long, because the document's not all that long. Preservation by God? Well, the founding fathers knew that Israel had come out of Egypt, and they came out of Europe, and they understood the preserving hand of God. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, and skipping down over a large paragraph to the end of the second paragraph, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. In the least familiar part of the Declaration follows a lengthy list of tyrannies and abuses of power by the King of England, the rationale for the Declaration of Independence. They sensed their preservation by God and spoke of it clearly. The providence of God? The very last words of the Declaration of Independence. For the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. A firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Same conviction Moses had about Israel. A third reality, reflected in the Declaration of Independence, prosperity from God. He was the source of it. Listen to this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, insert and women, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator, capital C, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're not given those rights by a king, graciously. Those rights come not simply even from the consent of the governed, although the phrase is about to turn up in the Declaration. But human beings, it was their conviction, are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and woe to the government that takes those rights that come from God Himself away. And finally, the potential for judgment. Listen to the beginning of the last paragraph of our Declaration of Independence. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. Did you hear that? Why, if it were said in the halls of Congress today, somebody would suggest to you that people were trying to bring religion into politics. And what are they doing? Well, these were our founding fathers. Appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, we do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Now, if you think that I have just been clever enough to match up the Declaration of Independence with Deuteronomy 8, I submit to you that there's plenty of evidence from history that they understood it that way. John Adams, our second president, in his inaugural address, his second inaugural address, March 4th, 1801, I shall need too the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our fathers as Israel of old from their native land, and planted them in a country flowing with all the necessaries and comforts of life. Specifically, John Adams saw that parallel. And Thomas Jefferson, the deist, the one who allegedly did not see the hand of God in history, the classic deism, the view of the clockmaker, Creator. He creates the clock, winds it up, lets it run down on its own, walking away, pays it no more attention. Now, Thomas Jefferson was an inconsistent deist, at least. Jefferson proposed a national seal for the United States, portraying Moses leading the chosen people into the promised land. Marvelous. It's just kind of fun to find those little things in history when you look around a bit, because our history's been rewritten for us. And the younger generation in school today doesn't have any knowledge of the fact that the Pilgrims on the first Thanksgiving did anything but get together and thank the Indians for not slaughtering them. The idea they were thanking God hasn't been included. And now some people, even as liberal as People for the American Way, are saying that's a distortion of human history. And whereas they don't want religion perpetrated in terms of its values, they say at least let's be fair and write history the way it took place. And we have to applaud that sense of fairness from whatever quarter we find. The evidence is overwhelming, so you'd really look stupid if you argued that the textbooks were fair and balanced, so they've acceded to one of the realities of our time. And we're glad for that. The vision realized was one of a nation under God, clearly. A responsibility and accountability depending upon the God who is there. That was the vision realized in 1776 by the Declaration of Independence and in 1787 by the development of the Constitution as the instrument to develop a nation which would carry out those values and protect them. If you need support, there's a whole lot more. Let me throw you just a few quotes and you will get the gist. Washington, in his farewell address in 1796, spoke of religion and morality as indispensable supports to political prosperity. When Ronald Reagan said something like that at a prayer breakfast in Dallas in 1984, he was accused of an heretical political view about a relationship of church and state somehow. But he was only almost directly quoting our first president, the father of our country. Where, wrote Washington in his farewell address, is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in the courts of justice? Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. John Adams, whom I mentioned before, it is religion and morality alone which can establish principles upon which freedom can securely stand. A patriot must be a religious man. That in a letter to his wife Abigail in 1775. In a speech in 1789 when our first vice president, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. And Thomas Jefferson, words that are on the wall in the memorial, our car wouldn't start on the 3rd of July. Unfortunately, we were going to the President's intimate breakfast down by the Jefferson Memorial where he made his speech on an economic Bill of Rights, and we couldn't get the car started in time to get down there. A freak thing that happened, but intimate breakfast with several thousand people, but nonetheless, we had our tickets. We were planning to go, but I always look as I enter from the front and face Jefferson to the wall on the left, where in one of those panels inscribed there are the words, "I tremble for my country when I recall that God is just." Again, the deist who somehow sensed, as opposed to deism as a philosophy, that the nation would be accountable to God. And James Madison, the author of the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, which include the First Amendment with its 2 religion clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, James Madison, before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. That was a conviction of our founding fathers. And that wasn't a conviction that just died out by 1850 or something. I've had fun with some other quotations asking people to project who might have said something like, doesn't this sound like Pat Robertson's speech running for president? Listen to this one. The fundamental basis of this nation's law was given to Moses on the Mount. The fundamental basis of our Bill of Rights comes from the teachings which we get from Exodus and St. Matthew, from Isaiah and St. Paul. I don't think we emphasize that enough these days. If we don't have the proper fundamental moral background, we'll finally wind up with a totalitarian government which does not believe in right for anybody except the state. Well, Pat Robertson might well have said something like that, but that was Harry Truman. It isn't just George Washington and James Madison. And how about this? Now this sounds like Ronald Reagan, and Reagan indeed uses a lot of terminology from this former president. This is not Ronald Reagan. Can you speculate who it might be? No greater thing could come to our land today than a revival of the spirit of religion. A revival that would sweep through the homes of the nation and stir the hearts of men and women of all faiths to a reassertion of their belief in God and their dedication to His will for themselves and for their world. I doubt if there's any problem, social, political, or economic, that would not melt away before the fire of such a spiritual awakening. Franklin D. Roosevelt. We're being sold a bill of goods today by people who do not recognize the intent of the Founding Fathers and the vision that was realized in 1776 and 1787. And thus I come to my second point in trying to think through with you what's constitutional, and that is that the vision's been revised. And I put a date there, 1947, because that's the date of a Supreme Court decision called Everson, that's the way it sounds, Everson versus Board of Education. In that decision, the Supreme Court of the United States appeared almost to baptize into the Constitution the phrase, wall of separation between church and state, adding to it two adjectives. They spoke of a high and impregnable wall of separation between church and state, never to be breached, no openings, high and impregnable. And that represented a turn from the vision realized in the colonial days, the vision revised. That has produced a series of decisions in the Supreme Court over the last 40 years that have moved us more and more toward a secularized state.